Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Radium and today I have another Calamity mod video for all of you, in which I'm going to be showcasing every single Supreme Calamitous drop or post-Supreme Calamitous weapon available to you. This is a very interesting list to make because there's a lot of diversity in the class, after you get to that stage obviously enough, and the weapons are so powerful, yet so many people don't actually know a lot about some of them, so I thought I'd just do a review, as the addition of the Rust and Dust update has actually made a few minor changes here and there, and so I thought I would just cover it. With that said, let's get straight into the video. The Animus is a true melee sword, obviously enough drop from Supreme Calamitous. It has a very high base damage with no projectiles, but very good statistics regardless, and it's quite a large sword as well. This weapon however has a very unique mechanic, exclusive to only it as far as I know, whereas it randomizes the damage upon contact with an enemy. As in, sometimes it can do slightly lower than the base damage of the sword, but other times, with no damage modifiers whatsoever, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of damage in a single swing. As such, it's very hard to gauge a DPS for this weapon, but I've figured out a way to do it, taking the lowest possible value of the sword and the highest, leaves you with, at base damage, approximately 4,000 damage per hit, and the sword is quite fast, so you can either go from 17,000 damage to all the way up to 600,000 DPS if you get the maximum value I achieved every single time. And overall, it's just absolutely incredible, although obviously it has its drawbacks as a true melee weapon. The Azathoth is the ultimate yo-yo in all of Calamity mod. It's the final one you craft, and it's truly just something to behold. It does an incredible amount of damage, and it shoots different projectiles to the Terrarian, although similar on the surface, which have the ability to shoot their own projectiles off of it, and additionally they can do damage themselves, and when the yo-yo is applied to the mix, the weapon does about 3 times more damage than it would with just firing the lasers. It is undermined by a lot of things, because there is a yo-yo you can get before this, which is actually a lot better in some circumstances. But at the same time, it can work very well, as it is literally the final yo-yo upgrade for the game, if you can call it that. It has a relatively simple crafting recipe, which is one I forgot to mention for the Animus, my apologies. And the crafting recipes are something very important with these weapons, as some of these items can use items throughout the entire game to forge up to them. But overall, there's not much going for this one. It's not appealing in terms of appearance, but it's a great weapon, and one that's definitely usable for any late game melee user. The Contagion is the final bow in the game. It does an incredible amount of damage with very fast speed and very strong knockback. The bow speeds up over time and shoots these spores behind the arrows as they travel, meaning it discards custom ammunition, but that's okay because the weapon is still incredibly strong regardless. You'll see, it's not really incredible on a single target, although averaging an extremely high DPS anyways. But the weapon shines against bosses that move towards you, as the spores additionally hit as well, and that can pretty much double your damage at bare minimum. Combined with certain Calamity accessories, this is arguably one of the best weapons for any ranger, and it's one I used for my original Terminus boss rush. So I would heavily recommend getting this thing if you're an aspiring ranger trying to take on the Terminus boss rush. The Crystal Crusher is a pickaxe, but also a beam weapon, which falls under the melee class. It has 2 different attacks, an incredibly fast melee swing, or a laser, depending on which click you use. Both of these do pretty high damage, but as the weapon is a pickaxe, it can actually destroy blocks, which is a very interesting mechanic the weapon possesses. The laser does a significant amount more than the melee attack, but both can be used for mining and combat. The only issue is, if you're trying to build an arena, you can't really use it with these fights, because if you fall down for a row of platforms, the Crystal Crusher will most likely destroy them all, and then you'll have a really bad time with your next battle. However, the damage is just too high to not look at, because it's one of the higher values for all melee weapons in fact, clocking in at about 200,000 DPS. It has a fairly standard crafting recipe as well, combined by the solar or any lunar pickaxe, a blossom pickaxe, and obviously enough the shadow spec bars. This is another weapon I never use too much just because of the issue that it is on the surface still a pickaxe, but if you don't really care about destruction, then go for this thing. The Dance of Light is a very late game magic spell, shooting a barrage of light beams through your character and spamming extremely fast. It looks incredibly hard to aim, but in fact the weapon has minor homing capabilities, so the vast majority of your shots do end up hitting. I don't believe I get it on camera here, but the weapon also has a flash attack which covers your entire screen in light energy, which then does significantly more damage than the individual blasts themselves. Oh, I did get it, nice. And the crafting recipe is also fairly simple. A lot of them are significantly more difficult to get than this, unfortunately, but this one's relatively tame regardless. It is a weapon that gets undermined by various other magic weapons, because mage is an incredibly strong class late game, and this does kind of pale in comparison to some of them, but it's still an incredibly fun and powerful weapon regardless. The Draconic Destruction is a melee weapon. It is a sword which fires a beam, which splits into various other swords, and pretty much ignores invincibility frames due to that, as every single sword that hits will do its own damage, which will compensate for the low base damage of the weapon, which is incredibly weak for a post-Supreme Calamitous weapon. You'll see it's averaging very good DPS, and it covers a wide surface area, so although it's good on single target, this weapon would definitely be optimized against, for example, a worm boss, as it will be able to pierce each segment multiple times, and it doesn't seem to be affected by pierce. So overall, it's a weapon that, similar to the Dance of Light, gets undermined by a lot of the other really powerful swords, but one I'd definitely be very happy with getting regardless. Earth is a true melee sword, which fires various beams upon coming into contact with an enemy. It's one of the most powerful true melee weapons in the game, if not the most, because the Animus is kind of RNG related, and this one has its own projectiles if you play your cards right. They rain from the sky and they gradually rise up and spread across your screen. They don't have any homing capabilities, but that won't stop them due to their really large hitboxes and high damage. So when you are hitting, it is very good. Of course, true melee weapons obviously enough have the drawback that you have to be close to enemies, and the only reason you'd really be using Earth at this stage would be doing the Terminus boss rush, where the vast majority of enemies can kill you in just a few hits. But still, it's a fun weapon to use, and if you don't mind getting hit a lot or have a very tanky loadout, this is another weapon I'd definitely recommend giving a try at some point. The Endogenesis is a very powerful summoning weapon obtained from Supreme Calamitous. It has an incredibly high summon damage, but additionally it has a very unique property. Although there can only be one of this summon, there are 4 different modes the individual summon possesses. 2 of them being sentries and 2 of them being active summons. One's a beam, one fires these ice projectiles, one acts like an extremely buffed deadly sphere, and the other is a fairly standard upper sentry, unfortunately. In my opinion, it's definitely worth going for the minions, as they're a lot more versatile, and the sentries actually do less damage when compared with the other things. So I'd heavily vie for using the 2 summons, but if it's your thing to use sentries, or you're doing that kind of playthrough, then go for it. It's nothing I can really hold you against. The crafting recipe is relatively simple as well. We're getting a little bit more complex now, using materials throughout the entire game, but it's still fairly obtainable. The Fabstaff is a very, very powerful magic weapon. One of the most versatile weapons in my opinion, as I love all the Ray style weapons, which this one falls under the category of. It attacks, and when you hit an enemy, it splits the beam, or it ricochets and hits the same enemy various times, basically amplifying the damage tenfold at a bare minimum. It's so powerful when you start spamming, and additionally they've very recently readjusted the weapon so it doesn't lag as much when you're spamming it. It has a very, very simple crafting recipe as well, of 100 Phantoplasm and 50 Shadow Spec bars, so although costly, it's definitely on the simpler side. One thing I would say about this weapon is that for worm bosses it really just cannot stop lagging, so although it's not usable in those situations, for 90% of the scenarios you'll be in, it's very good. The Flambrace Ring is a recent addition in the Calamity Mod's Rust and Dust update. It's an incredibly powerful must-have for endgame summoners, as it doesn't take up any minion slots, and is incredibly powerful to have as a secondary weapon. The weapon has so much versatility, having 2 unique weapons, the ability to transform into a missile, and the ability to downsize yourself at the cost of decreased damage. But all of that is really just reminiscent of how diverse this weapon is. In terms of the damage it has, it's just absolutely amazing for both of the weapons, and obviously enough, it's just a very nice item to have alongside certain summons, as it allows you, for the first time in pretty much the entire game, to attack from yourself as a summoner rather than just having to fully rely on minions, because obviously enough 1.4 hasn't reached Calamity yet. This weapon has a fairly standard crafting tree as well, which is a big surprise to me as I thought it would be incredibly difficult. But the items are not that difficult to obtain as they're common drops from bosses, or just fairly easy to craft. This weapon is still being found out in terms of its maximum potential, as the Rust and Dust hasn't been out for long, but in my opinion any summoner should use this item to absolutely maximise their damage output. And it's just great fun to use even if you're not a serious summoner. The Illusory Knives is both a melee and rogue weapon depending on the class you've been playing throughout your entire game, and it fires life-stealing homing daggers, which increase drastically in velocity if they finally come into homing distance within a target. The life regeneration on these is pretty significant all things considered, being able to generate bursts of 40 to 50 HP when you're using good gear is very good. And once again, it has relatively streamlined crafting recipe, as you most likely would have obtained all the ingredients for it before you've reached this stage. It's obviously composed of the Empyrean Knives, which is an upgrade of the Vampire Knives, and with those 2 weapons you know it's going to be good already. The statistics of this weapon are incredibly good as well. I personally don't use these too much because there's a lot of rogue and melee weapons which outshine this and do similar things, but for more clumsy players it's definitely good. The Nano Black Reaper is one of the Calamity community's favourite melee and rogue weapons. It's so powerful, it fires these scythes, which additionally split into these homing black orbs, and they rapidly home and hit enemies multiple times. This doesn't sound too complex on the surface, but the attacks alone are so powerful, and once you double down with the scythes, it does even more damage. There's literally not a single negative I can think about this weapon off the top of my head. It quite possibly might be one of my favourite weapons in all of Calamity. It's so fun to use, and the crafting tree seems very complex, but all of these weapons are most likely melee and rogue weapons you would have obtained by this stage anyways. One thing I would say is that this weapon is second to another item in my opinion, and it's the only item which really compares in both the rogue class and the melee class, but it's still very good. In conclusion, this is most likely one of the most consistent weapons I've ever used in Calamity for both the melee and rogue class, and I would very much heavily recommend grinding towards it or farming out Supreme Calamitus for this weapon before you go into Terminus if you main either of those classes, as it will be a great help. The Red Sun is a very underused Supreme Calamitus sword, which does incredible damage and a very unique effect where it shoots various projectiles across your entire screen, which split into these small homing projectiles that are very fast, agile, and do a lot of damage. Now, there is obviously a very big downside to this weapon, apart from the devouring of your frames, but it's literally got no control, because you cannot control where the projectiles go. Even if it's not homing in, the projectiles won't always do the maximum possible damage when compared with other swords with those kind of capabilities. However, it's still one I definitely recommend getting, as for certain bosses such as worms and larger enemies with significantly larger hitboxes, this might honestly be one of the best melee weapons to use. The Void Dragon is a minigun-esque ranged weapon which consumes bullets and is incredibly fast and powerful. It has a chance to turn some of the ammunition into these purple crystals, which develop the ability to travel slightly faster than regular musket balls and create a small splash radius on impact, doing significantly more damage and hitting multiple times per splash. This weapon is additionally affected by custom ammunition, which is a great property of it, so I would heavily recommend using Luminite, Chlorophyte, Hyperius, any of those bullets that kind of just boost the DPS slightly, as this weapon can be a little bit mediocre when just using musket balls. But it's incredibly fast, it's a very strong contender for a good range weapon, my apologies, and overall it's one I definitely obtain for Terminus, if you are an aspiring ranger that is. The Scarlet Devil is an infamously overpowered rogue weapon. It has such a high base damage and fires these homing spores as well as the initial spear, which splits into a firework on impact of an enemy, boosting the damage even further. Before you're even coming into contact with the enemy, it's doing 85,000 damage per second from the spores alone, and when the fireworks added in, it does significantly more as well. It, as well as that, has quite a simple crafting tree, using the Infernal Spear from Yaren, Bloodstone Cores, and other materials you'll definitely have in abundances by this stage. This is most likely, well in my opinion, the most powerful rogue weapon in the game, just because it just does so much damage on base, and with a modifier, certain rogue accessories, and maximum damage output, you can multiply this 110,000 DPS you're seeing now tenfold. The Soma Prime is the most extreme of miniguns in the late game. It fires its own custom ammunition, which is like super buffed Luminite bullets with no pierce. They're so incredibly fast, and a good comparison to the ammunition it uses is the Skull Masher bullets, but without the ability to split. It isn't affected by custom ammunitions, which is a big drawback of the weapon, but these unique bullets are so good anyways, just due to their high velocity. It's pretty much instantaneous to them reaching your cursor. This weapon has a fairly standard crafting tree as well, one you definitely have the majority of ingredients towards anyways at this stage. And overall it's just great fun to use. Despite not being the most powerful of ranged weapons, at least in terms of statistics, it's definitely one of my favourites to use regardless. The Staff of Blushie is one of the most unique yet questionable items in all of the late game. It has a very unique effect where it shoots these flames which is gradually increasing damage, and without using any buffs it'll cap at about 1,000,000 and then reset. The issue is once you reset the flame attack, it goes back to its original damage and the multiplier restarts from the bottom once again. It's also incredibly costly to keep up. I'd compare it to that of the last Prism, which is relatively expensive if you're rocking a good loadout, but overall it's great fun to use in my opinion. And literally it's one of the strongest weapons out of all of these in terms of straight up DPS, at least in terms of its maximum potential, which is kind of an unfair test. Additionally, it's got one of those extremely very simple crafting recipes, and although it's not that practical due to the limited range and no projectiles being fired apart from the radius you're in, meaning you have to get close to bosses as a summoner, which is a non-defensive class, it's still pretty good. The Svan Technical is a very unique ranged weapon. It acts like a shotgun and additionally a minigun, because it fires a barrage of bullets at your cursor and also fires a minigun trail behind it. It took me a while to fathom how to use this weapon efficiently, but to put it frankly, it's kind of difficult to use in certain situations, especially to players who are used to just a single trail of bullets. However, you're looking at firing and hitting so many shots if you're playing your cards right, due to this weapon's incredibly high fire rate, and the amount of bullets it fires per shot. It has quite a simple crafting recipe once again, using the souls from the mechanical bosses, which are obviously enough very easy to get, and overall it's just such good fun to use. Additionally, I'm just going to note that it does get affected by certain ammunition, so read into that what you will. The Temporal Umbrella is once again another very unique summon, which takes up 5 minion slots, but summons this hat above you which shoots out random projectiles throughout summon weapons the entire game has had to offer you. It's incredibly powerful and the projectiles vary from like different knives to axes to umbrellas to magical like entities, I guess you could call them, and it's just such a visually pleasing item to use. Additionally, this is something you'd pair with the Cosmic Immaterializer, the Flambrace Ring, I guess, and the Endogenesis. All of those summons would definitely partner up well with this thing. And it has, once again, got a relatively simple crafting tree. Obviously enough, it's a must-have for summoners, as you want all of these items most likely as a summoner late game. And it's just great fun to use, and I'd heavily recommend getting this. The next weapon is Tractus's True Palladium Mage Hammer of Might, which is a very big name, but it's pretty much the trademark of Calamity, one of the most original items from the mod. It does such great damage. It's a melee and a rogue weapon, which gives it some versatility to different classes, and it's just so powerful in general. One drawback I would say is that the weapon doesn't go past the edges of your screen, at least not by much anyways. And apart from that, there's really not that many flaws. High DPS, infinite pierce, very easy crafting tree, and all of that good stuff. And a decent damage per second output as well. So overall, this item definitely deserves its staple mark on the Calamity, and I'd heavily recommend getting this weapon if any of the classes suit you. The next weapon we're looking at is an incredibly unique one known as the Vemmons. This is a Revengeance mode exclusive weapon, which drops from Supreme Calamities as a guarantee, as I'm pretty sure. The weapon does get affected by mana sickness, and it has a very unique way of working. As in, the weapon does less damage the less health that your enemies have. So for example, it will do its maximum possible damage, which is 1 million or 2 million on crit, and it'll do so much damage in that kind of scenario, but after you use it a couple times it will start doing less and less damage. And it's important to note this weapon is the only Supreme Calamitous drop, as I know, that cannot be crafted, but that's just another reason to have this thing around, and it's very valuable for mages. The Apotheosis is widely regarded as one of the most powerful mage spells in all of Calamity. It has a great damage and very sparse speed, and all things considered, not a terrible mana consumption. It shoots this Devourer of God-esque looking head, which fires various projectiles out, which home to enemies, and if it's close to an enemy, the DPS will excel by so much. I believe I leave some extra footage in here just to show you what the weapon is, but to fund this incredible power, it has one of the most complex recipes out of all of these weapons in my opinion, just because the amount of various stuff throughout the entire game you need is very difficult to deal with, as well as a legendary weapon, which is literally a 1 in 1,000 drop chance, potentially, and literally has the highest DPS of any weapon in all of these, at least applied on single target, coming up to 4 million as far as I remember, which is absolutely insane. So overall, this is a very versatile spell. I don't really see any cons of it. I've tried it out on various different bosses, and it always seems incredibly effective to use, so it's a great weapon for any aspiring mage. The Eternity is my favourite mage weapon in the entire game. It creates such a cool effect where it guaranteed locks on to an enemy and continues hitting them, and then after that it ends in an explosion, doing about 1.5 to 2 million without any accessories or armor or any power-ups at all. If you could fund it, that is. However, it comes at a price because this is a very diverse crafting tree, although not as difficult as the Apotheosis in my opinion, as the items are fairly more standard in early game for the most part. But yeah, this is just one of the coolest spells in all of Calamity in my eyes. It does so much damage, and it's pretty much good in every single scenario possible. It always hits the right hitbox and is just a must-have for any mage. So please get this before attempting the Terminus boss rush mages. The final weapon we have to review today is the Elemental Excalibur. This is a weapon which doubles as both a melee weapon and a true melee weapon, where the damage increases once you do true melee, which is a right-click attack. It fires a variety of projectiles depending on the colour of the projectile. So for example, some of them home around you, some of them move slow, some of them have genuine homing capabilities, and some of them have infinite pierce. The list goes on, but it's just such a fun weapon to use. All things considered though, it has a very simplistic, very easy to obtain, but very varied crafting recipe, which will take you some time to farm for overall. One thing I'd say is that this is probably my favourite melee weapon to use out of all of the weapons offered, just as a personal preference kind of thing, because it does such great damage. You're seeing here it's coming up to like 250,000, which is absolutely insane, and in my opinion is the best melee weapon for all melee users. That's pretty much all of them summed up, so I guess I should give something of a conclusion on all of these weapons. The vast majority of them are so diverse and fun to use, and all of them will definitely benefit you after defeating Supreme Calamities for the first time, whether you're not using the class or not, as they are just a step above everything else. The weapons can offer you a bunch of variety, fun, and the ability to switch up your class for the first time in ages, and since you can access the Demon Shade armor at that stage, you have a very, very useful ability to pretty much use whatever class you want late game, and it's very easy to do so. With that said, I have to say thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, I will see all of you in the next one. Peace out, guys.